Hello, everybody. Welcome to our launch of the National Climate League report. I see the attendee number is steadily increasing, so I'll just wait for that to go up. My name is Hannah Muhajarine. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the National Campaigns Manager here at Climate Reality Project. And I'm also the coordinator for our National Climate League project, which we're here to talk about today. So thanks everybody for joining. I'll just give it a little bit longer for folks to join, but we have a lot to get through today, so we're going to start pretty soon here. I'm joining you today from Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, which is the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota and Dene nations, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Our organization's main office is located in Montreal, which is called Jojage, by the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, on whose traditional territory Montreal is located. We recognize our collective responsibility to dismantle the systems of oppression, such as colonialism, that created the climate crisis, and that this starts by following the leadership of Indigenous peoples. I'd love to learn a little bit about who all is here. So if folks want to introduce themselves in the chat, you can share your name, where you're joining from, including the Indigenous territory. And if you want to share anything else, a little bit about what brought you here today, then I'd love to hear that as well. Before we go further, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Adam for some notes on language and accessibility. The majority of these speakers on the call today will be speaking English, but we do have French automated captions. So I'm going to hand it to Adam, who's going to explain in French, for those of you who are francophone, how to set those up.
Bonjour, merci Hannah. Moi, c'est Adam Sommerfeld. Je suis directeur de communication à réalité climatique, membre de l'équipe depuis 2022. Je suis aussi situé à Jojage ou Montréal. Mon pronom, c'est Il. Ravi de vous retrouver pour ce lancement du 6e rapport issu de la Ligue nationale du climat, une enquête citoyenne et participative dressant le bilan de l'action climatique dans 53 municipalités tout à travers le pays. Depuis plusieurs mois, une équipe d'une 50aine de bénévoles ont fouillé rapports, portails de données, procès-verbaux et d'autres sources pour évaluer les engagements politiques en matière de climat dans leur municipalité locale. Et aujourd'hui, nous allons creuser ces résultats ensemble. Donc, on a hâte à ça. Si vous souhaitez activer les sous-titres en français, sélectionnez l'option en bas de l'écran Afficher les sous-titres. Et vous pouvez sélectionner votre langue de sous-titrage. Il y aura des parties du webinaire en français, notamment un témoignage une de nos bénévoles de la région de Montréal. Mais l'événement d'aujourd'hui se déroulera principalement en anglais, notamment le panel avec nos invités. Sinon, comme Hannah a dit, nous aimerions vous connaître aussi. Donc, nous vous invitons, si vous souhaitez, de vous présenter dans le chat en indiquant où vous êtes situé et votre nom, et si vous êtes avec une organisation ou non. Je vous rappelle également que la fenêtre de dialogue questions et réponses est prévue pour les questions à nos panélistes et tout autre message peut être partagé dans l'autre fenêtre, le dialogue chat. Et les questions et les commentaires sont les bienvenus en français. Je me ferai un plaisir de les traduire pour nos invités au besoin. Donc, sans plus attendre, je redonne la parole à ma collègue Hannah pour la suite. On to you, Hannah. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everybody who's sharing their names in the chat. It's really nice. I recognize many of these names and also nice to see some new faces. So thanks again for joining. The National Climate League is our participatory data collection project, where we train volunteers across the country to collect data tracking climate and sustainability progress at the municipal level. This is the 6th edition of the National Climate League report that we've done. And I want to take a moment at this time to also talk about Matthew Chapman, who was the one who originally dreamed up this project, and he gave it shape in its first iteration back in 2018. Matthew tragically passed away last spring in his home of Montreal, but he was a wonderful climate organizer, and I know that probably some and maybe many or most of you on the call today from our network and beyond had the pleasure to know him. I'm proud that part of him lives on in this project, and the NCL is also only a small part of his outsized, a tremendous contribution to the climate movement in Canada. So we're just keeping Matthew Chapman in our minds and hearts today. Our event is going until a quarter after the hour, and we have a lot to share with you. I'm really excited to welcome our other speakers who are going to be sharing later today, including Emma Mungall, Maren Lowen, Andrea Reimer, and Margot Shepard. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of them. But before we do, I'm going to share a brief overview of the NCL project, our methodology, as well as the highlights of our findings for this year. So if you're able to bear with me in a moment, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Seems like that is working. Great. Okay, so the National Climate League focuses on the local level as an area of climate action. Municipal governments have control over roughly half of Canada's emissions, and local climate solutions are also some of the most tangible, shaping what our homes look and feel like, how our neighborhoods are designed, and how we get to work or school in the morning, and more. They also have the power to transform our communities into more healthy, equitable, and affordable places to live for everybody. Across Canada, 650 municipalities have declared a climate emergency, and most large and medium cities have set climate targets and developed a climate plan. Residents may have opportunities for public engagement during the development of their municipality's climate plan, and probably many of you have participated, maybe from the perspective of a municipality or as a resident in shaping that climate plan and participating in public engagement. But once the plan is developed and released, it may be harder for members of the public, and I know I've had this experience as a climate organizer, to know exactly how your municipality is following through and whether they're on track with their climate commitments. So the purpose of the National Climate League is to call for transparency and accountability on the part of municipal governments, while also supporting climate policy literacy and democratic participation among residents. As I mentioned, this is the 6th year that we've run this project. In past years, we really focused on measuring outcomes with a set of outcome-based indicators, because we were really interested in tracking that tangible progress from municipalities on climate. This year, we actually expanded and shifted our focus a little bit. So people that might be familiar with the project will notice a little bit of a change this year. We wanted to include more of a policy lens this year. So almost kind of extending our focus backwards to not just look at the outcomes, but to look at the policies behind those outcomes as well. So we ended up looking at 23 policy indicators, 6 outcome indicators, and that data was collected by 47 volunteers across Canada. I want to give a big shout out to them. Obviously, they are kind of the heart of this project, and we will be hearing from Emma later as kind of the representative of the volunteers here today, but I know that there's many more of you on the call, And if anybody wants to introduce themselves in the chat and just share, if you collected data, share your name and where you collected for the city or town, then it would be great to hear from you now. So feel free to do that. We were able to gather data for 53 municipalities altogether. Our intention was really for volunteers to collect data for the municipality where they are based, because it's really meant to be a learning experience of also kind of familiarizing yourself with your city's climate plans and policies. But we also wanted to achieve a roughly even distribution and representation from municipalities across Canada, which we did. You can see the distribution of cities on the map there. And we also wanted to include a mix of larger urban centers and smaller rural communities, because we're interested in looking at what smaller communities are doing as well, and not just focusing on the Vancouvers and Torontos. No shade to the great climate work that both those cities are doing. These are our policy indicators. I'm not going to go through all of them. Again, I hope that everybody will check out our report for a full explanation of what we looked at under each of these categories. Our policy indicators were split into 5 categories. So the first one here is climate, just a bunch of, which looks at overarching climate policies, plans, and programs. Each of these was associated with a question that volunteers were asked to look into. So for example, the first one, climate plan, was just as simple as, does the municipality have a climate plan? What year was it released? A little bit of information about the contents of that plan, including, does it include an implementation strategy and an equity lens? We also looked at policy indicators related to buildings, transportation, as well as waste and natural infrastructure. And you can see the little icons here indicate the type of policy that it was, whether it was a plan, a target, a policy, or a program. Then we also looked at a smaller number of outcome indicators that you see here. So for example, what percentage of the municipality's population is experiencing energy poverty? These are associated and kind of sorted into the categories above. And we really tried to tie them to the policies and programs that we were looking at. This data was mostly collected from publicly available sources, because a big part of the project is looking at what is easily accessible to the public and what is publicly available. So the first place that volunteers looked was in the actual plans, as well as progress reports, meeting minutes from council and committee meetings. They did also follow this up with conversations with municipal staff as well, to kind of fill in the gaps. And then our outcome indicators were collected through national databases, because that was the best source for finding data that was comparable and that was available across a large number of municipalities. So that included sources like StatsCan, the Carbon Disclosure Project, Charge Hub for charging stations, and more. I'm going to quickly go through a few of our key results. These are just like a handful of our results. So again, this is all, I guess, just teasing the report and hoping that people will check it out after this. We found that 53 municipalities that we examined, out of the 53, 39 had a climate plan in place as of 2023, which is pretty good, but we see that changes when you break that down by size, so that there's a real discrepancy between the larger municipalities of over 100,000 and the smallest ones of less than 30,000. We looked at how many municipalities with a climate plan had published a progress report, again, with the aim of kind of tracking those practices around accountability. And we found that, unfortunately, over half have not published a progress report as of 2023. Of course, some of these municipalities only perhaps released their climate plan in the last year or so. But even so, we think that there's a little bit of room for municipalities to step up on those specifically public-facing progress reports. Also on the theme of accountability, we looked at how many municipalities had a citizen advisory committee that included representatives of residents to guide the implementation of a climate plan, if they had one, but also just general climate action in the municipality. We found that 17 out of the 53 municipalities had a committee in place that had a specific mandate around environment and climate. This is one example of some of our outcome indicator data. We looked at, on the policy side, cities' mode share targets, but then we combined that with data on mode share collected from Statistics Canada, mode share being the share of sustainable transportation methods that people use to get to work or school. So this data gives us a sense of which municipalities are doing the best on mode share, like Vancouver and Victoria, but which ones also have ambitious targets, like Calgary, as you can see there near the top, has a quite ambitious target, which is laudable, but also hoping that that's followed up with meaningful actions to actually start raising that mode share. Lastly, this is from the end of our report. We included what we're calling an overview or a municipal summary that shows the results for each specific municipality on each of the policy indicators. So if you're interested in reading the report about any specific results for your municipality and whether your municipality has a certain policy in place or not, you can skip to the back of the report and look up what its results were there. We can also see here, we're not exactly, I guess, calling this a scorecard because the policies aren't weighted towards their, I guess, impact on emissions. But you can see which municipalities here have the most policies in place. Toronto and Calgary actually emerge as the ones with the most in place with 80%. And the last thing I'll point out here is that, again, you see a trend of larger municipalities having, in general, more of these things in place than smaller ones. So I'm going to hand it over to Emma Mungall, who is a data collection volunteer, and she's going to talk a little bit about the data collection that she did for Montreal. Emma is currently enrolled in a master's program in environment and sustainability at Université de Montreal, and she also has a background in environmental chemistry. And she will be speaking in French, as mentioned before. So if you're an English speaker like me, again, you can just click at the bottom of your screen and select and turn on those English captions in order to understand what she's saying. So Emma, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, I'm Emma, et oui, je vais parler en français pour avoir une représentation francophone. Alors oui, moi j'ai une formation en sciences du climat. Je suis titulaire d'un doctorat en chimie atmosphérique de l'Université de Toronto, en fait. Mais je me suis éloignée de ce travail en partie parce que j'ai ressenti un tel désespoir. Je pense qu'on peut tous on sait tous c'est comme ça, mais au cours des 2 dernières années, j'ai commencé à m'intéresser aux solutions, les énergies renouvelables, les adaptations. Le désespoir s'est dissipé. J'ai eu envie de m'impliquer à nouveau dans le travail sur le climat. À peu près au même moment, je suis revenue à Montréal après une décennie passée à Toronto. Et j'ai été frappée par les excellentes infrastructures cyclables que nous avons ici. Je me suis intéressée au rôle que jouent les villes dans notre mode de vie. Alors, j'étais super heureuse de découvrir la Ligue nationale du climat et de m'y impliquer. C'est un projet qui permet d'utiliser mes compétences en recherche pour réfléchir à des solutions climatiques dans les villes. C'est toutes mes nouvelles passions réunies. Et j'étais également impatiente d'apprendre davantage sur Montréal, ma nouvelle ancienne ville. C'était vraiment le fun de plonger dans les sites web et lire un paquet de plans et de documents municipaux. Et finalement, ce que j'ai trouvé, c'est que dans l'ensemble, le plan climatique de Montréal est assez détaillé en termes d'engagement, ça couvre les bases principales, mais il manque de détails concrets sur la mise en œuvre. Il n'y a pas de budget, il n'y a pas de calendrier. Cela dit, la dernière mise à jour date d'avril 2024. Alors, ce n'était pas dans le rapport parce que c'était après la collecte de données, mais elle est très complète, ce qui est bien. Un engagement marquant est que Montréal est l'une des seules municipalités étudiées par la Ligue à avoir mis en œuvre une politique d'élimination progressive des combustibles fossiles dans les bâtiments. Et effectivement, Montréal est en train, depuis 2019, d'éliminer l'utilisation du mazout dans les bâtiments. Mais comme Hannah a bien expliqué, une des choses qui est vraiment excellente avec la Ligue, c'est que nous examinions à la fois les promesses et les résultats, les données. Alors, comment Montréal se porte sur ce plan? C'est en matière de mobilité que Montréal brille vraiment. L'intuition que j'ai eue en déménageant de Toronto à Montréal, que c'est un meilleur endroit pour les piétons et les cyclistes, est confirmée par les données. Et ce que je trouve passionnant, c'est qu'il s'agit en grande partie d'améliorations récentes. La dernière fois que j'ai habité ici, il y a 12 ans, ce n'était pas forcément le cas que c'était aussi bien pour les piétons, pour les cyclistes. Alors, plus spécifiquement, Montréal a adopté une politique de rue conviviale, Complete Streets, ce qui est le cas d'un moins d'un quart de municipalités examinées par la Ligue. Et mieux encore, cette politique a été réellement mise en œuvre dans des projets à travers la ville. Sans parler, il y a des rues entièrement piétonnes, de plus en plus à Montréal. Et en plus, en parlant de part modale du transport, la part de résidents à Montréal ayant un accès pratique au transport public est la plus élevée des villes recherchées par la Ligue. C'est près de 90 %. La part modale du transport en commun est également le plus élevée, à près de 30 %. Et pour le part modal du transport actif, on est juste après Vancouver, à 13 %. Et ça, c'est vraiment en partie grâce aux améliorations majeures récentes à l'infrastructure cyclable. Alors, dans l'ensemble, l'engagement de Montréal en faveur de l'action climatique me semble sincère. Le gouvernement municipal s'investit réellement dans l'action. J'ai l'impression que ce n'est pas juste des belles paroles. J'ai également participé à la vérification des données, ce qui m'a permis de lire des plans climat d'un grand nombre de villes différentes, ce qui était fascinant parce que je trouvais qu'on pouvait en quelque sorte percevoir le caractère des villes à partir des plans et avoir une idée de leur engagement, leur degré d'engagement vers le changement et dans quel domaine. Souvent dans les municipalités de banlieue, on voit cette tension entre la volonté de préserver un car culture et de vouloir agir sur le climat. Alors, je me sens vraiment chanceuse de vivre dans un endroit qui a l'infrastructure nécessaire et la volonté politique d'agir. Oui, c'est bien pour les résidents de Montréal, c'est le fun pour nous. Et oui, participer à la LNC a été pour moi vraiment une expérience précieuse. Non seulement j'ai beaucoup appris sur le fonctionnement des villes, ce qui est super intéressant, sur le pouvoir, la manière dont elles peuvent agir sur le changement climatique et sur le Montréal en spécifique. Je connais beaucoup plus sur ma ville maintenant. Mais ça a également renforcé mon intérêt pour le sujet Et comme Hannah a dit, je fais maintenant une maîtrise à UDM en environnement et développement durable, perspective d'aménagement. Et justement, j'espère faire carrière dans l'action climatique municipale d'une manière ou d'une autre. Et au-delà de cela, je pense que le bénévolat avec la LNC a des effets d'entraînement. Alors, j'ai parlé beaucoup de l'action climatique municipale à tous mes amis et à ma famille, ouais, sans cesse, là. Et bien sûr, plus nous sommes sensibilisés et impliqués, mieux c'est. Oui, Hannah m'a aussi demandé de faire un appel à l'action. Alors, le rapport LNC est destiné à être approprié par les citoyens en tant qu'outil de plaidoyer. Et heureusement, nous avons déjà une opportunité pour les personnes basées ici à Montréal de s'impliquer dans une action locale pour défendre le climat. Alors, la communauté métropolitaine de Montréal, la CMM, mène actuellement une consultation publique sur le plan métropolitain d'aménagement et de développement, le PAMAD, qui met à jour là, l'ancien devient vieux quand même, qui couvre le logement, le transport, l'environnement, ce genre de choses. Alors, il s'agit d'une occasion importante de veiller à ce que la justice climatique et environnementale soit intégrée dans ce cadre qui établira les lignes directrices à long terme en matière d'urbanisme pour toutes les municipalités de la région. Alors, une fois que vous aurez lu la LNC, vous aurez une idée à quoi ça ressemble, l'équité dans les politiques climatiques municipales. Vous pourriez vous inscrire à une formation avec Jasmine Lail, responsable de la réalité climatique, le 16 octobre, où vous pouvez apprendre ce qui contient la version actuelle du PMAD, la nouvelle, comment soumettre vos commentaires et quelques idées supplémentaires sur ce qu'il faudrait dire dans les commentaires. Les informations sont dans le chat. Alors, oui, merci, plaisir, à bientôt.
Thanks so much, Emma. We're really happy to hear from the perspectives of volunteers, and I want to thank Emma again for her dedication and diligence and interest during the NCL data collection. And again, there is a bit of a call to action there at the end if folks are interested in getting involved in the public engagement around the Greater Montreal region's planning process. Then please follow up with that. I think that there's information being shared in the chat right now. So moving right along, now that we've heard from the perspective of residents and volunteers, we want to hear now from municipalities themselves and councillors and former councillors. So I'm going to invite Margot, Andrea, and Marin to turn their cameras on, and we'll turn to the panel part of our event. Hello. Thank you, each of you, for joining us here today. We'll be dropping your bios in the chat so people can learn more about your background, but Marin is counselor for the city of Saskatoon, and I want to thank you for being here, even though I know that it's now officially election season for folks in Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan. And Margot Shepherd, counselor for the city of Fredericton. Margot has also been actually doing a lot of close collaboration with Climate Realities Fredericton Climate Hub. So that's really amazing to see. And I think that Marin also actually works or has collaborated with our Saskatoon Climate Hub. So we really appreciate that support from city councilors. And then last but not least, Andrea Reimer is a professor of public policy and global affairs at the University of British Columbia. She's also a former Vancouver City Councillor, among many other things, including she's actually a trained climate reality leader, having participated in one of Climate Reality's training programs that we do. So thank you, each of you, for joining us here today. And yeah, we're going to get right into it. We have some questions specifically around kind of public engagement, climate progress, and involving residents in decision making. So excited to hear the perspectives from each of your respective cities. The first question is just if you could share a little bit about examples of climate initiatives being taken by your city that you are most excited about. And I know that we went through the NCL policy indicators really quickly, but if there are any that jumped out at you that you noticed that are related to things that you know that your city is working on, then we'd love to hear about that. I'm going to maybe give this question to Maren first to talk about Saskatoon.
Sure. And Hannah, I hope you will cut me off if I am rambling. But I just want to thank you and everyone else for giving us this chance to connect with one another about this today, and for the report itself, which is very exciting as a source of information for policymakers and for residents too. So I wanted to share a little bit about some things that I'm excited about in Saskatoon. I think we've made some important progress on a couple of projects that have sort of been waiting in the wings for a long time. We've advanced some important work on a utility scale solar project in Saskatoon, which has been in the plans for a long time, but difficult to get it into the execution stage. We've really been evolving our extreme weather response, which is sort of a cross-jurisdiction exercise, and it involves, planning with fire and police and community organizations. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about our flood control plan, because this is a major project and probably one of our biggest ticket items when it comes to climate-related expenditures. But I'm not sure that most residents would even identify or think of this as climate action. We received $22 million from the federal government to initiate a flood control plan and build storm retention ponds in city parks throughout the city. We were experiencing, everybody knows this story, like for 1 in 100 year rain events in the span of 10 years, and people were experiencing displacement, property damage, and so forth. So this is a major project that has allowed people to protect their homes and for us to protect public infrastructure, but it has also it's one of those projects that has a lot of co-benefits because it's led to the revitalization of city parks. So this is something I think most people would drive by and not see as climate action, as climate resilience. But that's a project that is exciting to me because it was, we were able to do a big lift and it was not controversial. And so it was exciting to be able to advance something like that.
Thanks, Maren. Yeah, I would love to do, I think for the next round of NCL, one of the things that we're considering is perhaps doing a adaptation focused version, because of course cities are on the front lines of responding to the climate crisis, and adaptation has such an important equity and justice element as well. So that's exciting to hear about in Saskatoon. Margot, same question, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks for setting this whole thing up. It's great to participate. Our city is roughly 70,000 inhabitants, and before I got on council, one of the policies that they had developed was to buy up floodplain lands along the banks of the Willistook, the St. John River here. Because we had experienced some severe flooding, and my family had personal experience with that. And so that's a really good policy. It has a lot of benefits or co-benefits for climate, for natural infrastructure, for stormwater management, and so on. And speaking of that, we do have a no net increase in stormwater generated from new developments. And our city is growing a lot, and it's growing quickly. And so that's a great policy that we have in place. I don't want to go through a shopping list, but there's a lot of exciting stuff going on right now where we have a new green buildings policy, a greening of our fleet at the municipal level, and an anti-idling policy for staff. we are in the process of buying hybrid buses, which is made more challenging simply because, well, we have an ask in for $11 million at the Municipal Borrowing Board, but the number of bus manufacturers I've just heard has really gone from, you know, in the 20s to down to 4 manufacturers. So that's a real challenge. There's a big backlog for hybrid diesel buses. At some point, you know, it would be great to see our fleet go to all electric, but that is something we're working towards. So there's lots and lots of stuff going on. We have a fantastic climate and environmental specialist at the city, and you know, that's an area I think we need to work on. She's doing everything and more that she can, and it would be great to see her have some more resources. But I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Margot. Andrea, over to you for talk about climate initiatives at Vancouver.
Yeah, for sure. And I should preface by saying I'm not a current city councillor. I've been off of council now for 6 years, although obviously still very invested in it. I was the lead when I was on council in developing Vancouver's Greenest City Action Plan, as well as our renewable city strategy. So they're like children you kind of keep an eye on as they're growing up out there in the world. I will say that this wasn't a particularly great year for those children. Our city council, our current city council, made a decision to take out one of the key pieces of the work around natural gas and getting people off natural gas over time. So we'll see where that all ends up. It was done without, and like getting like to the core of the work that you're doing with the indicators was done without any public advance notice that this might be coming in. And so there was no ability for people who might be supportive to mobilize around it. The good news was it was based on an annual report. When we first established Greenest City and the action plan, we embedded in it a requirement for annual accountability reporting. So there were 17 metrics in the original plan, and these were reported out on annually. And luckily that has stayed in. And so unfortunately, this was at the annual plan where this motion came out of nowhere, which is technically in order, but I would say ethically and in the spirit of good governance should have had some advance notice for people. So that's the bad news. The good news is Vancouver continues to have a robust plan. The staff in the city have been working very hard to implement the plan. As long as those are the targets, they're going to work hard on that. And the city has over the years developed a really strong staff team that's able to do that and look for those opportunities. So some of the things I've been proud of the staff's work over the last year has really been working on, I think the shining star is the equity work and the adaptation, not just similar to what Maren and Margot have talked about, that there's just really a big shift that we've seen over the last couple of years in the way people are understanding adaptation as core to, and that it's not adaptation or mitigation, it's that we can have strategies that do both, right? And that at the same time are supporting other objectives in our city around social justice, economic development, other things. And there's been some really great, like Margot, I don't want to like detail them all out, but luckily there's an annual report at the City of Vancouver that you can check out to learn more about everything from cooling centers and water access, shade access, trees. I have to say, one of the things, like if I have to look at shining stars, this indicator report that you do across the country is such a great opportunity for cities to learn from each other. But also just looking at what you're measuring is amazing, right? When we started this work back in 2008 was when I started on it as a counselor, people thought we were a bit out there for including things like urban forest and canopy cover, right? That just wasn't understood as climate action at all. And now to see that these are very core parts of what you're measuring, and therefore what's driving cities across the country to be like, if we don't have that, why don't we have it? And having to explain that to people, I think is great. And hearing from Emma, thinking of this army of volunteers across the country that's doing this work was really inspiring as well.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Yeah, oh, so much that I want to respond to in there, including what you're talking about Vancouver's rollback of the fossil fuel or the plans for phasing out fossil fuels. But there's too much to talk about, I think. Thanks for those kind words about the project. And I will say, oh yes, on the point of adaptation, we did look at how many cities have an adaptation plan. As I said, we don't have a huge focus on adaptation, but that was one like central piece that we looked at. And yeah, finding that cities are more likely to have a climate plan than an adaptation plan, but that often uh, uh, they're combined. And so we included, we had to, I guess, like revise maybe how we were looking at that question a little bit as volunteers were reporting the data, finding that often municipalities are just creating a combined mitigation and resilience strategy, since there is so much overlap, including the natural infrastructure and urban forest piece that you were just talking about, Andrea. So that was an interesting finding on our end as well. Moving to the next question here. As we've been talking about, a big part of the NCL is kind of equipping the public with tools to participate in climate advocacy and decision-making processes around climate. So we're wondering, from your perspective, how has your city made steps to include residents in decision-making processes around climate in a meaningful way? We'll change up the order here and start with Margot this time.
Thank you. So I would say that Fredericton could do a lot better in engaging its residents in decision-making processes. To date, there have been only sort of limited sessions focusing on very specific things, such as branding and so on. And I will say that it was in part, this is the reason why I ran for city council in 2021. I just felt that people's views weren't being taken into account, and so that was a major development for me. And so I've learned how to do how the system works in the city, and I am now better equipped to find those intervention points where citizens and groups like Climate Hub, which is just formed in Fredericton, can be productive and constructive in the, for example, the review and tightening up and revising the policies or the action plans. And that's been very, very, very helpful. I think people have to talk to their councillors. They have to talk to their councillors more, because the councils, municipalities are very pragmatic: water, sewer, garbage, recycling, and these is long-term, arguably, well, definitely more important in the long term. Issues like climate change have to involve a lot of citizen and resident input, and involve all sectors of society, all incomes, all cultural, etc. backgrounds. So I guess I think people have to be protected, and we have adaptation plans, we have energy and emissions plans, and are doing a great job as a corporation, as a municipality. The whole community aspect hasn't been worked on as much. The city wanted to do its own house, get its own house in order, and it's doing that, and therefore we can become a bit of a model for other people. So I kind of ranged all over the place, but that's my response. Thank you.
Well, I liked how you started off your answer, Margot, which is that if you don't feel involved, you can also just run for city council and become a city councilor.
That's right. Don't get mad, get elected.
Marion, we'll give it to you.
Sure. Well, like Margot, I do think that Saskatoon could and should likely improve the way that it engages on these issues with the community. I do think that we are improving. And when I think back to some major initiatives in Saskatoon, like the creation of our low emissions community plan, which is largely our mitigation focused umbrella under which individual climate action projects are situated, that did involve a fairly robust public process. I think the difficulty, at least for me and for us in Saskatoon, I think, is that, you know, there's a lot of discourse about the larger project, but where the rubber hits the road is finding funding for individual initiatives and making sure that they move through council and remain a priority. So when you're setting the targets and the goals, I think we've been quite good at engaging in a public dialogue about the importance of that work, and where it can be harder is actually making sure that the components of those plans are actualized. So I think we're improving, and I have to say there's a lot of great local organizing happening in Saskatoon, and my colleague Serena Gersher and I share a strategic portfolio area for environment and sustainability. And so we've been trying to nurture relationships with the community to make sure people know when those individual projects are coming through council or budget, and to try to forecast some of the work that's happening. The city is planning to refresh that big document. And so I know they're planning to do engagement, but I think, you know, at the risk of eating the lunch of some of our upcoming questions. Part of the difficulty too is just in a landscape where there's a lot of political urgency around other issues. Keeping climate at the forefront of the public discourse is challenging, especially because I think issues of affordability, housing, and homelessness, which of course we all know are really interwoven with climate issues and climate justice, are sort of leapfrogging, I think, in the public's interest at this moment in time. So it's a difficult political context in which to keep climate as a priority at the local level. But I'm really encouraged by what I see as increasing collaboration between local government and community activists, at least locally here in Saskatoon.
Thanks, Marion. And yeah, I want to, I guess, recognize your efforts for valuing collaborating with community members. I know from our perspective, it's really nice to have allies in local government. Andrea, I just realized I I put you last 2 times in a row, so maybe we'll start with you next. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you for this question.
Yeah, no problem. I feel like as the non-current counselor, that's all good. I'm like the backup singer here. So 2 observations on this question. The first is that, and just for context, like 2008 was a long time ago, right? And so Obama had literally like just been elected about a month before I was to the Vancouver City Council. There was this whole Yes We Can energy. It was very much about the power of people and connected networks. And, you know, Obama set up this open government and digital agency that really expanded public understanding and expectation of involvement. And that definitely, you could feel that over the border. Vancouver is very much a border city, right? Like you can literally walk to the border in about 3 hours from downtown Vancouver. So it is, you know, there's a lot of influence here. And so in that context, it was not unexpected or unreasonable to have this massive engagement project. So we ended up engaging about 35,000 residents directly, another 500,000 in the region of 2.5. through advisory committees and representatives, and this like all funneled into the action plan. It was like an amazing, it was the largest and continues to be the largest single public engagement in Vancouver's history. But then not unlike what you've heard, like as time goes by, the funnel just starts winnowing down, right? I'd say the one thing that was in place during Green a City, which ended in 2020, was that we had these internal advisory committees. We had 10 areas that we were looking at in Green a City. And then each internal advisory committee also had an external advisory committee that might be just, you know, the Food Policy Council, for example, isn't experts. It's just a citizen's advisory. Your expertise is being a citizen, and that's great, or a resident actually is a better way to put that. And then some of them, like Green, the economic piece had an actual economic council that was involved, that are people involved in green economy work. And so these advisory committees comprised about 300 people, when like 10 each, and they all have like memberships. We had Green a City summits where we bring together the external advisories with the internal advisories, and then some other people who just wanted to come and see it. And that would happen annually. And it was really amazing. But over time, as the sort of yes, we can feeling has worn off, you sort of seen the funnel go down to like very skinny, like maybe 8 people advisory committees for the whole thing. And then that disappeared altogether about 1.5 years ago, and they're just sort of pulled together as working groups. So there was a fantastic working group on climate equity and justice, but then once their project went to council and unfortunately was not approved, it just kind of disappears, right? So you don't get that you don't get a payoff for the investment that residents have put into becoming literate about city policies and getting the relationships with staff. They're just sort of flushed away, and then you get a new group in that has to learn all that, and just when they're able to be effective as an advisory committee, they're gone as well. And so I think that we need to figure out like where is the sweet spot. And so my second observation, I'm sorry, I feel like I might have been going on a bit here, but it is about that sweet spot of engagement. If you ask people, and I do consulting work now with First Nations and local governments in a number of areas, but climate plans is definitely one of them. And one of my clients brought me in after they had consulted that their strategy for building the plan was to engage all their residents and ask what should be in this plan. Well, they got a great laundry list, but it's not a climate plan. It's just a laundry list of you know, why should residents be experts on the strategic interventions that are going to best use the resources and capacities of a government to be able to reduce emissions, right? And so that, I think, is a thing we need to take into account. In Vancouver, we set our targets without engaging. We brought in an expert panel to do that because the experts know what the targets should be. But then we asked the public, if these are the targets, what are you prepared to live with to get there, right? Here are the various ways we can get there. And we want to know what you, of these options, which one makes the most sense to you. And I think that's a reasonable place to engage. And I think the current environment we're in, you get, I mean, at an extreme level, you've got Elon Musk screaming about that free speech is hate speech and free speech are the same thing. And I think in that environment, it's very hard to have literate and nuanced discussions about these kinds of issues, about where residents' time, energy, and expertise has the most impact on the outcomes of these plans, so that they are building them in a way that meets residents' needs, but also respects the science and the reality of what we need to do to take meaningful action on climate.
Thanks, Andrea. That's, yeah, all super interesting. And I didn't think that Elon Musk was going to come up on this panel, but shout out to Elon. Yeah, I think tuning or tuning your engagement strategies to where it's most appropriate makes a lot of sense. And I think one thing we think about is like framing that as necessary for building that public support, though. And so residents having input, and if the question is about things that are going to impact residents or about actions that residents have to take, then tailoring those questions for public engagement so that you're choosing the actions that actually have public support and buy-in behind them is important. Yeah, and then the other thing, again, I guess I don't want to talk too much, but there is so much there. One thing that we did find in our report in relation to what you're saying about committees is we didn't break it down actually in this report, but perhaps we might look at this later with our data. I thought it was interesting to make a distinction in between cities that have committees, or how many committees are made up of experts versus those committees that are just there, like you said, to represent or residents just because they're a resident of the city. And then also a distinction in between like task force committees or short-term committees versus standing committees. We found that, of course, lots of municipalities have like an advisory committee for the development of their climate plan, but then not always a standing committee that exists beyond that, that's charged with overseeing the implementation. So that was an interesting observation. Our next and second last question is again kind of related, but we're wondering, how does your city communicate the climate actions and perhaps the progress on climate that it's making? How does it communicate that to residents? And yeah, we'll start with you, Andrea, this time.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I think I spoke to it a bit earlier, so I'll be short. That this was an integral piece of it, was giving people the tools to be able to hold the city accountable. That still exists. I'm hoping it continues to exist. I did note in your evaluation, and I think it was a fair evaluation, that Vancouver no longer does regular GHG inventories, and I think that's ultimately what you need to do. Having said that, I noted that I think pretty much no city is doing regular GHG inventories, and that really comes down to cost, right? Like what you can justify, and where here in British Columbia, BC Hydro, so we have like one utility that has a monopoly on electricity in the province, or near monopoly. Should be careful about that. And they have a strong impetus to want to fund conservation of energy, because that is their best strategy for creating new energy. Which is great. And they have put money into these community energy advisors. It's why you see so many British Columbia local governments who've done, smaller municipalities who've been able to do excellent work. Maybe there's an opportunity there for them to fund GHG emission inventories, or some national effort on that, because I think continuing to criticize municipalities for not getting there, when I think it really is a resourcing issue, is going to be a tough sell.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, and also I feel like that applies to many other of these data collection, data tracking, communicating, like tracking progress, like issues, is that understandably municipalities might think it's better to direct their resources towards actually undertaking those actions, or that's the priority before measuring progress. And I think that makes sense. Margot, yeah, talk a little bit about Fredericton.
Sure. Well, Fredericton has an environmental dashboard. It records things and, sort of after the fact. A recent initiative of our wonderful environmental specialist, Gillian Hudgens, has been to put together a climate newsletter. We haven't established the name of it, but there's been a couple of editions put out. So that's for anyone who wants to sign up. The challenge is, of course, getting people to go and sign up and show an interest. But I see we also have, just in the past couple of years, put in a mass notification program, and you have to sign up for that too. So I see the potential there, in the future, to mass notify people of all manner of, climate related hazards and so on, but that's not on the table right now. So we don't have we have a standing committee called Environmental Stewardship. I'm the vice chair of that committee, and it hears progress reports from staff on how they're implementing bits and pieces of the climate plan and the adaptation plan. But really, we saw a gap, and along with several other concerned residents, we formed a Fredericton Community Climate Hub. And that really, because there's no advisory committee on climate to the mayor, and we didn't see a sort of an interest in forming that, we are doing our own thing, working with the city's plans, identifying gaps, trying to be creative so that we can involve the community in positive climate action, so that rather than sitting around at home getting depressed and anxious, they can have an outlet, because it's a really great vehicle, and we're just getting organized, and there's seems to be a lot of grant money that we can tap into. So yeah, that's about it for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Margot. Maren, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so in terms of sort of ongoing communication and accountability with the public, there are a couple ways that we try to achieve that. We do have some annual reporting in terms of our strategic plan and our progress on our commitments in the city's strategic plan with respect to climate action. And we've also started building into our annual budget process a climate budget process, which I think it's distinct from a carbon budget process, which essentially sort of rations or allocates GHG emissions in the city's activities. And the political context being what it was, we did not think we could achieve that. We would not have been able to put that in place in Saskatoon, but a climate budget is essentially illustrating the gaps between our stated goals and our action in terms of the amount of money we would need to commit to achieve those stated goals, and also the missing GHG reductions. So we've set a bunch of targets with respect to GHG reduction, both corporately, like for the city and for the broader community. And, you know, this will probably be familiar to a lot of people. We're not meeting our targets. And so this climate budget, it's new. We just started it last year. And the intent is really to be accountable, to show people, we said we're going to do this, but we're only here in terms of our sort of spending allocated to these projects, and we're here in terms of our GHG emissions reductions. I would say the downside is like, and this is, I think, a common peril for local governments, like producing a lot of information isn't necessarily the same as being transparent and accountable, because a lot of the information that we produce is honestly pretty difficult to understand. And even for councillors, you know, to read an additional report that's 100 pages long in the context of a municipal budgeting process. So information isn't necessarily the same thing as making sure that everyone understands what's going on. So I think we can do more, and that's no criticism of our amazing administration who simply did what we asked them to do. But one thing we learned from that climate budget process last year is just that we need to break it down a little bit further to make it less technical and more digestible. So I think there's a willingness and an intent to be accountable, but it is difficult to translate what can be highly technical or sort of fiscally coded language into stuff that makes sense and resonates with the community. So that's kind of where things sit. I feel like it's a bit of an evolving state in Saskatoon right now.
That's really interesting. I didn't know about Saskatoon's climate budget. I think that's a really cool tool that, again, maybe other municipalities might be interested in. And then also on the piece around like technical language and communication, I think that that's definitely one of the goals of the NCL project too, is to like, yeah, municipalities perhaps actually are sharing these reports, but our job is also to gather that and turn that into something that's more easily legible and interpretable by a regular member of the public. Our last question, which maybe we'll just do like a really quick short round of answers, and then we'll take some questions from the attendees. And yeah, if you have any questions for our panelists, please start putting them in the Q&A now. Our last question, though, is what is one thing you'd want residents to know about engaging their municipality for greater ambition on local climate action? Again, I think this is keeping on the same themes that we've been speaking to, but if you had one kind of takeaway, what would it be? Margot, we'll start with you.
Well, I think I've mentioned about, talk to your counselor. Please talk to your counselor. They have your interests at heart. And if they're not hearing about something, they're not going to pay a lot of attention to it. I'm a big fan of the concept of participatory budgeting. And we're currently doing our budget right now. And there is really, that I can tell, there are no opportunities really for the public to get involved in that. And in part, the accounting methods make it very difficult for even someone who wants to scrutinize a budget to get a good sense of where money's being spent on climate related things, because they tend to be spread out all over the place. And I would say if there's, one thing that would be great is if, our climate actions could have a line item so that we could see where the money's going. That would, I think, provide a little bit of more visibility and, ability for the public to see where the money is heading. So that's a bit about it for me.
Thanks, Margot. Andrea, any advice for people looking to make an impact?
Yeah, well, two things. Elections really matter, like a lot. So don't, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say it. I've spent a long time in both advocacy and activism, community organizing, and electoral politics. I have a lot of friends who think that electoral politics are too something for them. I'm not going to throw an adjective in there, but if you're trying to change policy and you're not willing to participate in changing the people making it towards people who are more aligned with your point of view, you're leaving a lot on the table. So, and councilors matter a lot. And so you see it on that list of cities, the ones with strong mayors who are 100% behind climate action are the ones that are kicking ass. It doesn't mean they're the only ones doing it, but it makes a big difference. And it's tough. I mean, all of us as councilors, I had an amazing mayor. I can only imagine what it would be like trying to climb that wall without a mayor who was 100% there with you. The other thing I would say about it is there's no such thing as impossible in policy, no matter how, okay, so you missed the opportunity to get involved with the election, get ready for the next one. But in the interim, don't give up. I've seen, if you would have told me that Gordon Campbell was going to do the carbon tax when he first got elected here in BC, I would have been like, it's possible. But it turned out I was the lead negotiator on the enviro side for that. It was totally possible, right? And so don't give up on policies, but be strategic about how you're landing them with different governments and understand what those governments see as priorities.
Thanks, Andrea. That's great. Maren, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I'll try not to be repetitive, but I do think that the advice you've already heard is great. And that if you are part of sort of a grassroots climate organization in your community, that's wonderful. But you can also, just as an individual, for us in Saskatoon, the critical decision-making period around sort of the prioritization and resourcing of climate action happens at our annual budget process. So individual emails to your counselor to say, hey, I just want you to know that this is a key issue for me. Those kinds of points of contact in a smaller mid-sized city where your counselor is the person getting all the emails. I can't speak to the experience in other types of local governments, but it does make a difference and it is influential in the discourse. just a couple of comments on the broader context, which I think are useful in thinking about the strategy piece that Andrea's just mentioned, is, you know, I think, as I mentioned earlier in the call, the information that I'm seeing suggests that climate is slipping as an electoral priority for a lot of Canadians because I think not because people don't care, but because there are things that feel more urgent and emergent, like housing and homelessness and affordability. Based on sort of the data I've seen, it's sort of leapfrogging climate as an election priority for people. And I think we all understand that these things are deeply integrated issues. And so I think one of the challenges for people wanting to make progress on climate issues is keeping it on the radar in terms of the top issues in Canada. And so thinking about articulating how these issues are intertwined, that cities can be run most affordably and equitably if we have effective climate adaptation mitigations integrated strategies. You know, talking about energy poverty as a challenge, for example, just thinking about in the current context, how conversations about climate can be reframed to keep them relevant. And the other thing I want to say is that, you know, we all know that a change in the federal government is very likely. And I think that's going to put additional pressure and urgency at the local government level to maintain climate action. The present federal government has been quite supportive of local climate action in terms of the funding made available to cities. And I think we're all expecting that that will change when the federal government changes. And so thinking about, you know, how do you keep climate at the top of the list and how do you keep your elected officials focused on action in the context of sort of potentially dwindling resources or shifting priorities is something that you as individuals and organizers can start to think about, because I think it's going to be really, really critical. We know that local governments is kind of where the rubber hits the road on lots of climate action, both in terms of equitable adaptation and also mitigation. So I would just say, I think it's really important to keep in conversation with your neighbors and your elected officials about this, and that if you're doing it alone, it's still effective. It's great if you're doing it with other people, but it doesn't have to be the case if that's not available to you.
Thank you all. We are basically at time, but I wonder, there was a question in the chat, so I wonder if maybe one of you would be willing to give like a 1-minute answer to this question, because I do think it's interesting. Gabriel asks, I'm wondering, how can you avoid issues in social acceptability and potential NIMBY reactions to local mitigation and adaptation projects? I guess I'll open that to you three. Is there any one of you that wants to maybe offer some very brief thoughts on that? Andrea?
I dumped it in the chat. I'm sorry, I can't give you a link because my browser keeps crashing, but read.climate.ca. They have phenomenal tools that look at polling across Canada and regionally and messages that are working in different contexts from the macro to the micro. And I would absolutely recommend their resources. And they have annually produced new polling, and they have a big webinar series coming up too that I think are happening both in October. We're signing up for it.
Fantastic. That's actually a great segue into our kind of wrap-up section, because I'll give a quick plug. Climate Reality is actually co-hosting a webinar series about barriers to climate implementation that's kicking off on Monday. And the first session is going to talk about social barriers to climate change, and Amber Bennett from Reclimate is going to speak about their work. So we'll be dropping a link to that in the chat. But I want to thank each of you, Andrea, Marian, and Margot, for a really interesting discussion. I really love getting the chance to chat with you and learn more from you, and appreciate you offering your knowledge and perspectives here. And thank you to everybody for joining. Again, thank you to all of our NCL volunteers that helped to create this report. We'll be dropping a link in the chat to where you can download French and English versions of the NCL report. And we mentioned many times on this call Climate Realities community climate hubs. If you want to see if there's a climate hub in your community, then I'd really encourage you to get involved. If there's not a climate hub in your community, then we have staff and tools and resources to help you start one. We'll be dropping information in the chat about how you can connect with other folks that are working on climate advocacy and hopefully, again, use the results in the NCL report to advocate for better climate action and ambition. So thank you so much. And thank you to Emma again for presenting on her data collection experience. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll hope you keep in touch with Climate Reality and other folks on this call.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.